All right, my name is Abby Gray, and I am a mom of two and also a speech language pathologist, feeding therapist, and lactation counselor. My journey to pregnancy with my first was it was during COVID. My husband and I had been living in Boston and we were in a one-bedroom apartment, both working from home. So we decided we were going to get out of there because it wasn't really working for us. And we moved up to Maine, which is where I'm from. And so we started trying, and it took us about 6 months to get pregnant. He was due in June, or no, sorry, he was due in July of 2021. Um, so I was doing my training to become a certified lactation counselor while I was pregnant with him. And I learned a lot about the labor and delivery and medications during that and how that can impact early breastfeeding success. And that was a huge priority for me, was to be able to breastfeed exclusively. And so my plan was to take as unmedicated of a route as possible during labor and delivery. And my OBGYN was really supportive in that aspect. So, learning to breastfeed, even though I had completed my lactation counselor training at that point and taken the test, and then found out later that I passed the test, which was exciting. I still felt a little lost because even though I had all the training, it just, when it's your own body, your own child, you just it's like you forget what you're doing, or you don't know how to apply the knowledge that you have. Um, and so but it did feel like it came naturally, and things I felt like were going well. And he seemed to be gaining weight well. Oh, I forgot to mention that he was a really big baby. So he was born at 37 weeks and he was 8 pounds, 5 ounces, which I am glad that he didn't go to 40 weeks because he would have been massive. um, and but he seemed to be gaining weight well, and kind of tracking on his growth chart, which was great. And then, but things kind of fell apart with our breastfeeding journey after I had to have my surgery. So I started having really bad lower back pain, just randomly when I was about 5 weeks postpartum. I also was dealing with constipation really, really badly after his birth. And then I went to urgent care and they ran a bunch of tests and they couldn't figure out what was going on. They did an CAT scan. They did a transvaginal ultrasound. Um, and then I can't remember what other tests they did, maybe an x-ray. And I think it was on the CAT scan that they saw that there was a cyst on my ovary, but they weren't sure how big it was. I think they said it was only like 6 centimeters or something like that. They did a laparoscopic surgery. So they went in laparoscopically and looked at the cyst. And then the recovery process was really difficult. I was under the impression that it wasn't going to be that difficult because it was laparoscopic, but it was really, really, really hard. And it was still really painful. And especially breastfeeding was really hard because the positions that we had been breastfeeding in were not really working as much anymore because of where my surgery incisions were. So we kind of had to figure out different breastfeeding positions to get into. And then it seemed kind of like things were taking a turn with breastfeeding. Like he was falling asleep. Previous to this, I do remember he was a sleepy feeder, so he would fall asleep a lot while he was breastfeeding, but it happened even more so after this, it felt like, and I was unsure about my supply. And then, so between his 2 month doctor's visit and the 3 month one, he actually only I can't remember. I think he either only gained half an ounce or he lost half an ounce. So that was scary because it was like, he's supposed to be gaining all this weight and now he's dropping percentiles. And, he was like 99th percentile when he was born and he was dropping like really steadily down. And so that's when I started going to see lactation consultants and trying to investigate what was going on with my supply and figuring out other breastfeeding positions. And then we ended up doing triple feeding, and I was like exclusively pumping for a month, and it was really, really challenging to do that. And it really took a toll on my mental health. I started to have really bad postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression. And I really didn't want to feed formula because I just had it in my mind that we were going to exclusively breastfeed. And with my lactation counselor training, I don't see anything wrong with formula, but for me personally, I was just very set on exclusively breast milk. So, the lactation counselor that we worked with through the hospital, where I had my surgery, they have an ability for me to buy donor milk. So I started using donor breast milk because I wasn't pumping enough for what he needed to eat in a day. So donor milk was a huge, huge, huge help for us. And for me, like mentally, it really was very helpful. And the donor bank that we use is Mother's Milk Bank Northeast. It's like New England based. And they are an amazing association. They have milk banks throughout the US, but because we were in Maine and Boston, they were like our go-to. And that was a huge help for me. And then just working with different lactation consultants. And then, given the fact that I'm a speech language pathologist and I have some training in tongue ties, also, I kind of feel like that might be what's going on. And it was a real struggle to get that actually diagnosed. Our pediatrician was more old school and didn't really believe in tongue ties and how they can impact babies breastfeeding. And so finally I saw a lactation consultant who was like, okay, I feel like we've ruled out everything else. Why don't you go and see this pediatric dentist, and see what their recommendations are. So we went to see a pediatric dentist, and they were like, oh yeah, he has a posterior tongue tie. And he had like a little bit of a lip tie, but they were like, you don't need to release that. So we had the tongue tie released. And it wasn't immediate, but I want to say like 2 weeks after having it released and doing like oral motor exercises with him and stretching and things like that, he was back to breastfeeding well. And then we breastfed for like 18 months. So prior to the tongue tie release with the lactation consultant that we worked with in the hospital, we did some suck training. So using like a gloved finger or a pacifier to kind of like get his tongue working in the way that it needs to for him to be able to express the breast milk that he needs. So like putting finger in and like kind of pulling it out so that he has to like pull it back in, and just doing like stretches and sweeps with your finger under the tongue and around the cheeks, and getting that tongue moving in all the directions that it needs to be able to do that movement to express the milk from the nipple. So triple feeding is typically recommended if you want to continue on a breastfeeding journey, but your supply is not enough, or your baby's having difficulty with breastfeeding directly from the breast. So that looks like you breastfeed from the breast, and then afterwards you give a bottle, like a top-up bottle of a certain number of ounces of breast milk, and then you pump to replace that milk that the baby's taken through the bottle. So it's like those three things at every feeding. But it's a very short-term solution, or a short-term process to a goal, because it's really difficult, because you spend a lot of time. I mean, babies are supposed to eat every 2 to 3 hours at that age. And you're like, I was spending, an hour plus doing that process. And then, all of a sudden you turn around and it's time to feed again. So you have to go through it all again. And it's really challenging. And then I was also, so we did triple feeding, I want to say for like 2 weeks, maybe not even, because it's really like should be only a short-term recommendation. So then I was exclusively pumping, because I was trying to increase my supply, and like know how much he was getting every day, because we were trying to increase the amount of ounces that he was drinking in a day. And so we did that for a while. And then we also added a donor milk to get him up to the number of ounces that he needed. And so I spent a lot of time attached to my pump, which was really hard, because exclusive pumpers are like angels of the world. I don't know how people do it for a long, long time. I did it for a month, and it was really, really difficult, because, you have to pump every like 2 hours, and with a new baby, it's really difficult to do that. And at that point, I didn't have a wearable pump. Not that I would have used it anyway, because that should be a secondary pump. But like the primary pump should be, one of the more sturdy ones. So it was, luckily I had a pump that didn't have to be plugged into the wall, like a rechargeable one, but it still was a lot. And then I wasn't consistent with introducing the bottle, because I was like, had PTSD with pumping with my first. So I hated pumping. I was like, I'm not going to do it. We used the Dr. Brown's bottles, with the air vent thing. So they're the ones that look like there's the bottle, and then they have the little either blue or green thing that goes inside it, and then that attaches to the nipple. So those ones I highly recommend. Those ones worked great for him. They were, let's see, the nipple for those is really good too. So the rule kind of with nipples is the more that they look like a breast, the worse they are for wanting to transition between, if your goal is to transition between breastfeeding and bottle feeding, and also for like their oral motor development, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it's helpful to have ones that like have a slope that kind of looks like this. So the Dr. Brown's they're a little bit more narrow, but they are good, because what happens with your nipple when you're breastfeeding is that it stretches. So it doesn't actually, when they're actually breastfeeding, it doesn't look the way it does when they're not breastfeeding, when it's inside their mouth. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking for a bottle. You want one that is not necessarily shaped like a breast or a nipple, because it does stretch when they're breastfeeding. So that one was great for my first. He took to that one no problem. So we had bought a bunch of those, and he took to those ones no problem, which was amazing. They were a little bit of a pain, because they have a million parts to clean, because they have that vent inside it. So that was a little bit frustrating, but he was pretty good about not caring about temperature of milk. So that was great. We didn't really have to warm bottles. And so we kind of slacked on bottles. And then the next time we wanted to introduce a bottle, he was like, no way, I'm not taking that bottle, completely refused bottles. So we went through a period of bottle refusal with him, which was really rough. So tried a whole bunch of different bottles with him. And the one that a lot of lactation consultants recommend is the Lancino bottle. And it has a really good nipple that's like silicone and kind of stretches a little bit. It has that like gradual slope to it, which is great. And it's a little bit wider at the base. So he finally, after we tried so many different things with him, finally took to the Lancino bottle. So if there are any babies out there who are having bottle refusal, that's a one that I highly recommend trying because it's works wonders, I feel like. At least it did for us. But he was also very particular about the bottle had to be a certain temperature. So that was a little frustrating because we were like, now we can't just grab a cold bottle on the go and give it to him. We had to like warm it up. And I did try a bunch of different bottles with my second, but the Lancino was the one that he really took. And for me, it was a priority to be able to find bottles that he could switch easily between bottle feeding and breastfeeding, and also that were good for oral motor development. Pumping with my first, I used a Spectra pump, the S, I can't remember if it's the S1 or the S2, the one that's rechargeable that you don't have to be plugged into the wall for. It's the blue one. I want to say it's the S1. And flange sizing is huge with pumping, like making sure you have the right flange size. That was huge. And I used, they're called Pumpin' Pals. They're like these silicone flanges with my first that seemed to be really helpful for building my supply and also for not having pain with pumping. With my second, I used a combination of my Spectra and a wearable pump, the Willow Go, and had success with both of those. More success with the Spectra just because it's a primary pump. It has a stronger motor. And with my first, I also rented a hospital pump through the hospital, the Medela, I think it was the Medela Symphony. But I didn't really feel like I got a better output with it than I did with my Spectra. So I mostly just used my Spectra. So in the beginning, I used my Spectra primarily. I don't think I started using my Willow until he was like 3 months old, maybe. And my supply had been like established, and I felt successful with my Spectra pump. But I would use my Willow Go when I needed the flexibility to be on the go, to be able to just like put it in my bra and pump without more discreetly. And also driving and having a toddler and a baby, it was really helpful to have that as an option. And I made sure to have the right flange size. With the Willow, they make silicone inserts that you can put inside their flange. So I used that. I used both the Willow brand and I want to say it's May Mom. Legendary Milk inserts for those. And those were really helpful because that's another thing is that nipple size is not talked enough about, because the pumps offer you with like 24 millimeter flanges, which is huge and often not the size of a woman's nipples. So I needed a 17, I think it was 17 millimeter, which is substantially smaller than what's offered with it. So had to buy inserts and different flange sizes for my pump. But once I got the right size, it made a huge difference with my first, with my output. And with my second, I already knew to make sure I measured and had the right flange size. And then I did travel when my second was, let's see, that was February. So 8 months old. And he was like exclusively breastfeeding at that point. We had introduced solids, but he wasn't doing solids very frequently. So I had to pump a lot while I was gone. And I just brought my Willow with me because I knew I was going away for my brother's birthday and I knew that we were going to be out and about doing a lot. So I was like, I'll feel more comfortable pumping with this. And it went well. I mean, I feel like I pumped probably not exactly as much as I would have with the Spectra, but I did get a good amount every time I would pump. So my advice in terms of breastfeeding, if that's your goal, after the baby comes, taking a prenatal breastfeeding class is huge. So I highly recommend that to get prepared ahead of time and kind of have an idea of what might come up and what to expect before the baby comes and you're exhausted and the baby's crying and you're crying and everything seems to be falling apart. And I do teach a prenatal breastfeeding class myself, so that is something that I highly recommend for new moms to take. And even if you're a second time mom, because your journey the second time around could be very different than the first time around.